And Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, and it is brought to you today by the Gallery Bar Book and Games and Ocean Casino Resort. This football season, we'll be there every Monday for the Sports Bash. And don't forget to check out oceanac.com. You must be 21 or older to play. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. All right, Eagles joint practices today in Cleveland, and, of course, tomorrow as well. And the exhibition game number 2 this Sunday right here on 97.3 ESPN. Couple things that Andrew DiCecco from InsideTheBirds.com is going to be looking at, and what he saw on Friday night as he joins us now for another edition of Football at 4. Andrew, what's up, my man? How are you?
Mike, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
We're always good, man, talking football with you. And obviously, we got these joint practices, and I just want to kind of get your take on how important these joint practices kind of have become for these franchises that basically don't want to get guys hurt in the exhibition games, and they want to see certain things, and they can kind of script them out. So how important are these next 2 days for this Philadelphia Eagles team in Cleveland?
Oh, they're incredibly important. And the great thing about joint practices, Mike, is that teams are able to determine, as you sort of outlined, they're able to determine what they want to see, what kind of looks they want to see, what the rotation is going to look like, and they're more in control as to the flow of practice and things like that. When you're in a game situation, obviously there's so many different variables that are out of your control. Not to say that that's not the case in joint practices as well, but you have a little bit more of a handle on as far as, volume and injuries and things like that, and you're able to sort of monitor, make sure they're getting their water and their rest and so on. So I think it's these joint practices are very intense, and I think it's almost even more intense in the preseason because everyone knows when you're going into the preseason, your starters are only going to play a handful of snaps. Out here, it's hot. You got a lot of guys that are jawing back and forth. You got the coaches that are up on you, and it's just an atmosphere that you can't really replicate outside of a regular season setting, in my opinion. So I think it brings the best out of players, and it really drives the competition. So I'm excited to see what the Eagles are able to do and who's going to rise to the top, because that's really going to be an ultimate indicator as to what the Eagles really have, and the Browns for that matter.
Yeah, and I know one thing is that this Browns team is pretty solid. So the Eagles are getting 2 days in practice against a team that's pretty good. Not that we can't, something you really can't say from what we saw from the Jets. The Eagles really dominated that game. The first team guys, they were up 14-0. So let's get a couple guys that you liked what you saw from. I know you wrote about it InsideTheBirds.com. The fringe guys, the backups, guys who are trying to make the roster. Who helped themselves out last week, and who are you looking for to kind of build off that this week?
Well, he's not a fringe guy, but I was very impressed with Cam Jerkins and what he was able to do. I thought he looked natural and adjusted to the speed of the NFL pretty seamlessly, which you don't always see from a young offensive lineman, but very fluid, and he was as advertised. As far as, backup players, I was actually impressed with a couple of young defensive backs. Josh Joby from Alabama, who I mentioned on your show, oddly enough, last Thursday, and I was also impressed with Reed Blankenship, the safety, who really has an interesting path to the roster because, as they outlined on the Inside the Birds podcast recently, the safety position outside of Marcus Epps is pretty much up for grabs as far as the roster and positioning goes. And they seem to really like Reed. If you look at him, he led all defensive players in tackles. He saw a healthy share of snaps. In the practice I was at, he saw some second-team reps. He's even seeing some first-team reps given the health situation at the position and the lack of numbers there. So those are two young players that I really would like to see more of on Sunday when they play the Browns. Offensively, I would like to see some more of Jalen Reagor and see what he's able to do. And he seems to be a more focused player, and he's not taking these reps for granted. So I want to see what he's able to do. And just, some of the young offensive linemen, right? I want to see what Coyote Awashika is able to do. He's a player that has positional versatility. He can play guard, and he can play probably right tackle. He's more of a guard. He's always 6'4", doesn't have that lengthy build that you would really like from a tackle, but he was a tackle at Buffalo. He's a player that the Eagles really like. They did all they could to hide him last preseason. Now the secret's sort of out. They try to stash him on the practice squad. But I think this year, if they part with him, I don't know that they're going to be able to get him through waivers and back onto the practice squad. So those are just a handful of players that I'll be looking to see something out of as we move forward here.
Yeah, I know that everybody loved what they saw from Jordan Davis and Covey Dean. Those seem to be the two names that stood out. Were you as excited about what you saw from those two? And then, just kind of in your mind, how Davis kind of changes what this defense can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're not going to see a ton of stats at the end of each game in the stat column from a guy like Jordan Davis. But as I've outlined when he was drafted, he brings so much to the table, and he affects so many different variables and levels to that defense without having to necessarily get a sack or a tackle for loss. He's just he's a people mover. He's very disruptive. He commands double teams. And like I said, guys like Josh Sweat, Brandon Graham, no matter who it is, Covey Dean, who's a terrific blitzer, these guys are all going to thrive and get to the quarterback and put hits on the quarterback. And all these things add up, and it ultimately takes pressure off of the secondary. So he's just such an important factor, I think, in what these Eagles are going to be able to do moving forward, that you can't even measure what he's able to do from, in order to really appreciate what he's able to bring from a skill set standpoint. You just have to know all the different facets of the defense that he's able to impact, and in essence, what he's able to do for Jonathan Gannon as far as being able to call different things and a little bit more flexibility on his end.
And Dean obviously was kind of one of the names that you heard from a lot of people. But unfortunately for Dean, he's in a big battle at linebacker. Not something we could say about this team the last couple of years, but I don't know, what kind of role does he end up having with the way T.J. Edwards has performed in camp? And, of course, Kaiser White, he had the interception, and he's performed well as in camp as well as Dean did in the game on Friday night. So it's going to be interesting. I talked with Jeff yesterday, and he talked about, hey, look, Dean still has really 3 more weeks to try to show that he belongs and to earn more snaps. How do you see that linebacking position kind of materializing through this week?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It really shows how far the Eagles have come now that we're not really sure. They almost have too many guys that have ability, and you're wondering how they're going to configure into the overall defensive landscape. So the way I see it, and yeah, Jeff's right. 3 weeks, isn't exactly a lot of time to make an impression, but it's still enough time to prove that you're ready to carve out a more substantial role on defense. Now, what I really like from Covey Dean is he showed that he's instinctive. The moment's not going to be too big for him, even as a rookie. He's played in a lot of big games. He's a terrific blitzer. Like I said, he sees it. He sees the way that he sees everything. It's almost like how a quarterback sees the entire offense. I think that he's able to process quickly. He's able to find the hole and make the play, and a very smart football player. But a lot's been made out of the camp that T.J. Edwards has had, and rightfully so. He's had arguably the best camp, or one of the best camps of anyone that the Eagles have. But I think that in the same vein, Kaiser White, at least when I was there, really impressed me, and I think that he could very easily lead the team in tackles. A very fluid player, instinctive, flows sideline to sideline, and I just think that he's another guy. We talk about processing. He's someone that processes things very quickly. He got his hand on a couple of balls that day. So he's someone that it's going to be very hard for him to sort of find his way in and supplant either T.J. Edwards or Kaiser White. But I think that Covey Dean's going to have a role. And we haven't even mentioned Davion Taylor, who has also put together a pretty strong camp in his own right, stayed healthy most importantly. So I think he's going to be the third. But I also think you're going to see situations where Covey Dean's going to factor in, because he's too talented of a player not to see the field. So
it's funny talking about
question.
It's funny, Andrew, talking about trying to find ways to get more linebackers on the field.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Dean and Taylor and White, for that matter, they all have a skill set that lends itself favorably to the current NFL defensive landscape, in that they are undersized by most linebacking standards, but they're very fluid. They're athletic. They flow to the football, and I think the Eagles need more of those type of guys, and they have a pretty good trio of players that can do that. And I think now you need to figure out you're going to mix and match your personnel. But I do think that all three of those guys are going to have a pretty significant role, some of them situationally in the case of Taylor and the Covey Dean, at least initially.
Football for Andrew DiCecco, Eagles and Browns getting at it this Thursday, Friday, and then they play the exhibition game on Sunday. Safety, I mean, we got to figure out what's going on there, and it seems that the Eagles don't know still. They made a trade this week to bring another safety in. Haven't seen much from Jaquiski Tart. Obviously that's a position that was up in the air. Where are they at that position entering this game number 2?
Yeah, you'd be hard pressed to find a weaker position or one with more question marks currently than what the Eagles have at safety, right? I mean, Anthony Harris was a starter for the team last season, but he's an average player. He's very pedestrian. I mean, you can find a lot of Anthony Harris's across the league. I don't know that he really moves the needle much. You know what you're getting in him, so there's some comfortability there and stability knowing that he was in the defense. He was in the defense last year, so he's familiar with the system and the verbiage. But at the same time, Marcus Epps is your best safety, right? So, and he's a player that hasn't played as a starter. He hasn't played a full season as a starter. So there's question marks concerning Marcus Epps, as well. But that said, Jaquiski Tart's a guy that's played a lot of football with the 49ers, right? We know that. He's an enforcer, very physical player, has a little bit more range and athleticism than an Anthony Harris does, but he hasn't been around, and he's been slow to grasp the defense. So that is a problem in of itself. So how does he slot in? How quickly is he able to get on the same page and do what the Eagles need him to do and get up to speed? I don't know. We're going to find out. He's a player. We mentioned guys that I'm going to be watching. He's a player that I'm going to be keying in on because if he can't factor into the defensive equation, that's going to be even a bigger problem because you mentioned only having 3 weeks to figure out what you're going to do with the Covey Dean. Well, they only have 3 weeks to figure out how they're going to configure their safety depth chart and allocate snaps in that regard. So I think you could even see another trade if they don't really like what they see because you only have one safety you can really count on, and that's Marcus Epps.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And, I find this week to be interesting because of where they are in Cleveland and who runs the Browns. Andrew Berry, Catherine Raich is there. So Howie Roseman can have some conversation with this Browns team over the next couple of days. So don't be surprised if maybe these two teams come back with different pieces after they play on Sunday because the Eagles, as you mentioned, probably still looking for safety help because that's probably, of all the things, Andrew, is that still probably the most up in the air position on this roster?
Yeah, it's the most concerning when you're looking at it from a personnel standpoint. Even with a strong defensive line and an improved linebacking core and even two strong corners in Darius Slay and James Bradbury, that's still not enough to overcome a vulnerable middle of the defense, right? I think that you still need to have at least one safety you can certainly count on. And Marcus Epps is their best coverage safety, don't get me wrong. But, again, he hasn't done it for a sustained period of time. So there's a lot of question marks there, and I think you need to have at least one bona fide playmaking safety on that in that defense and have Marcus Epps as a number 2, as a complementary piece, rather than being the top guy, the featured player at that position. I think that would be malpractice should the Eagles go into the season with him as their top starter.
Yeah. Let me get your thoughts on, you mentioned Josh Joby and what that, I guess the next group of corners look like after Bradbury and Slay and Maddox, of course. Who are the guys emerging? If somebody was to get hurt, God forbid someone got hurt at that position, who are those next group of guys that are kind of separating themselves? We just see Jimmy Moreland got released, and he was a veteran player that maybe the team had hopes that could fill in for somebody had there been an injury, but now he is injured and released. So who is kind of rising to the top of that second group?
And I maintain that Jimmy Moreland would have made things interesting had he been healthy, having seen him at the Shrine Bowl and having seen him what he was able to do with Washington, just a very physical, chippy player, vocal guy, leader, glue guy. I think he could have factored in the nickel and also maybe even some safety looks. But nevertheless, right now, when you look at what they have, I personally have been impressed with Josh Joby. Now, he got targeted quite a bit in the preseason game, but he didn't really make a whole lot of plays. But the fact that the Eagles were willing to give him very early looks is telling as to what they've seen from him in practice, which really passed the eye test for what I saw from him in practice. Remember, I mentioned him in my observations piece, as someone that caught my attention and stripping Richard Rodgers from behind after he'd gotten beat, or just, taking things personal when somebody caught a ball in front of him. He was he stuck to guys. He was very sticky in coverage. And, yeah, he allowed some completions, but I thought that, his makeup and his physicality that you would expect from an Alabama player really stuck out to me. And when I wrote my post-draft piece, I had him as a fifth-round draft pick and someone that I thought could make a team as a safety or corner, and because he doesn't have necessarily the measurables or the top-end speed, but I think that he's really impressing the Eagles with how quickly he's able to grasp what they're asking him to do. McCain's a player that many people wondered when the Eagles have acquired him. He's been on and off the roster. I've seen him get targeted quite a bit. I think he's a little grabby. I think he's going to get quite a bit of snaps here on Sunday, so I'll be interested to see what they have in him. Obviously, they have a great deal of interest in him. Mario Goodrich, that undrafted corner from Clemson, was someone that he got a lot of hype as an undrafted signing, and rightfully so, given his pedigree, but really has been outshined by Josh Joby and really hasn't really lived up to the billing as being one of the crown jewels, if you will, of the undrafted free agent. So I think he's got a lot to prove, and I think he's going to see quite a bit of snaps as well.
All right, on the offensive side, real quick, Andrew, running back, is there some concern there? Are you okay with what they have?
I mean, if I'm the Eagles and I'm calling the shots here, I have some major concerns here at running back. I mean, the running backs as a whole, when you look at that unit, Mike, I look at it as just a very pedestrian unit. What is the identity of that group? Who is your playmaker that you can lean on in critical moments to get those tough yards? Who's going to be the consistent home run hitter? Miles Sanders has done it, but he hasn't been consistent in doing it. Kenny Gainwell has really fallen off a little bit in training camp. He's gotten hurt. Remember, he had the hip issue, but he's dropped a couple of passes, and, you're starting to see now all of a sudden from a player who could have been a breakout guy, you have a little bit of questions because it's not necessarily set in stone. And Boston Scott is who he is. I mean, there's a lot of Boston Scotts across the NFL. There's a lot of Boston Scotts sitting out there in free agency right now. I mean, they have a lot of guys, but not necessarily. You have the names, but you don't necessarily have the production or a player that's going to take that position group to the next level. So I think that would be a position that they need to look at and least get a power back in there for someone that can have that add another dimension to their backfield, because they have a lot of guys that offer similar skill sets. A player that I'm really looking forward to seeing what he's able to do, only got one snap last week on special teams, that is, and that's DeAndre Torrey, the diminutive running back from North Texas, who goes about 5'7", 195, very fast. I think he had 1,300 yards rushing last season, explosive home run type of hitter. He's a bit of a long shot for the roster. I would consider him a considerable long shot for the roster, but still, I just want to see what these guys are able to do situationally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting. I think that running back slot, they gave Jason Huntley 20 touches on Friday night. Did he do anything to make you say, yes, I need to see more of him, and I think he can help this team out? Or are you kind of ready to move on from him? He's been here for 3 years.
Yeah, he's been here for 3 years. And Jason Huntley is one of those players that he's not necessarily – he's gotten the opportunities, but he hasn't necessarily maximized those opportunities. In camp, he's looked great. And this is going back to last season when I've even made note that he impressed me and I thought he looked the most fluid, and I liked his acceleration and burst and all that. But when you're looking at it from a game situation, he does a little bit too much dancing, not a lot of hitting the hole north and south. And I do like what he brings from a kick return perspective, Mike, but he's really hasn't done a lot to really – again, he's not special. And if you're looking to keep a guy on there that's a fourth running back and a kick return specialist, you want to have somebody that has special traits. And again, we go back to, I mentioned Boston Scott. You can probably find a lot of guys across the league that have the same skill set or similar skill sets as a Jason Huntley. He's just gotten the volume, but you would like to see him do a little bit more with those opportunities.
All right, you mentioned special teams. Let's look at that. Britton Covey was a guy we were all kind of hearing a lot about and wondering if he could get a roster spot, maybe as a return guy. Is this still Jalen Reagor as your return guy in the punt and the kick game?
I think as of right now, you would have to say yes. I mean, Britton Covey is a guy that impressed in practice, and you like his short area quickness and acceleration, and his change of direction is outstanding, but you want to be able to see it in the game first. before you're able to, pencil him in as one of those 53 players that are going to make the final roster. I think sometimes, and he really has had an outstanding camp. I don't want that to be misconstrued, but you have to be able to translate that onto the field before you're cemented into a roster spot. And I think he had one return, wasn't able to do anything too much with it. But Jalen Reagor brings a lot more from a receiver perspective, and when you're looking at more of a complete player and what the team really needs, I think you get a lot more out of Jalen Reagor than you would out of Britton Covey. Again, that could all change based on what you see on Sunday and moving forward. But right now, I think you know what you have in Jalen Reagor. I think you see the athletic profile, and you hope this has been his best training camp, by the way, and you hope he's able to put it all together and tap into that natural athletic prowess, because he gives the Eagles so much more than what a Britton Covey would. But again, that could all change in a matter of weeks. It's a very fluid situation.
Yeah, last thing is Reed Sinnett did not really jump off the page last week. In fact, he struggled. Carson Strong, we didn't see it all. I would imagine Sunday those two guys get a bulk of the reps.
I would have to think so, yeah. And an interesting, when I was at training camp, Carson Strong didn't get any reps. So I don't even view it as a case of the Eagles looking to bury a player so that another team can't get any film on him and they can't get him through waivers, because if that were the case, then they would have given him reps at practice. I think this is a classic example and a prime example of a player who isn't necessarily ready for prime time. He's not ready to go in there and take some snaps and orchestrate an offense. And I do really think that they like what they've seen from Reed Sinnett, and they wanted to get him some game reps, because, as I said, Reed Sinnett's a player who always started his senior year in college, and the more reps he's gotten, the more comfortable he's gotten, and you're able to see what he's able to do, and as a more refined passer and leading an offense. So he had some hiccups early, and I expected him to come out swinging a little bit earlier than he did. He's able to put it together and salvage his performance. But I think you're going to see those two guys handle the bulk of the carries, the bulk of the snaps, though I wouldn't expect Carson Strong to all of a sudden light the world on fire. I think one thing that folks need to understand is that he's going to be a work in progress.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, there you go. A look at what's happening with the Eagles finishing up today against Cleveland tomorrow, and then Sunday you can hear the game right here on 97.3 ESPN. Another edition of Football at 4 in the books. Tomorrow, Adam Kaplan's live in Cleveland. He will join us at 5 o'clock from Cleveland with an update on practice and everything that's happening there today. Andrew, we appreciate you as always, pal.
That went quick, man. Enjoyed the time.
Always does, my man. Always love talking football with Andrew DiCecco here for Football at 4. And Andrew's back, of course, next week here on the Sports Bash.